Hello everybody, this is Denise and you're listening to the official third episode of The Actor's Vow. I hope you guys are doing well. We're still in quarantine. I personally have been baking brownies more than I should and taking care of my two newly adopted guinea pigs. If you haven't seen them, go check them on my personal Instagram because they're the cutest things ever. But other than that, also over The Actor's Vow, we just started a new series called Sunday Spotlight. And we're going to be featuring every Sunday a different artist, either an actor, a musician, painter, any kind of artist that might not be that known, or someone who is more established but just wants to share their story. And, I always think that acting and theater and film, it's all about community. It's all about helping each other and support. And your story might inspire another artist. So if that's you, that you want to be part of the community and support others, or you know someone who would be a good fit for Sunday Spotlight, submissions are open. You can go to the link in bio in The Actor's Vow Instagram or on the official website, theactorsvow.com. There's a special section on the homepage that says Sunday Spotlight submissions, and you only have to submit once. Every week, I'll choose someone different, and it will be just lined up. Just submit once, and if you are chosen for Sunday Spotlight, I will email you and then we'll start the interview process. So I am so excited and honored to present the first Sunday Spotlight. Her name is Ella DeVito and she's a recent graduate. Actually, she graduated this month, so congratulations, Ella, from EMDA in New York City. And while she was in school, she directed plays, she was in numerous shows and TV and film, and she even was on Netflix, and she's writing her own shorts and doing a bunch of stuff. Really, her interview was really interesting. I can't wait for you guys to read it. She's an up-and-coming artist, and I'm sure she will do amazing things. If you want to find her before Sunday, where you can read her interview on the Instagram page, she has her own personal Instagram, at Ella_DeVito, and she also created an art group on Instagram for artists to share their artwork, and it's really impressive. You guys should check it out. The Instagram handle for that is at @the_art group. So now let's dive into the topic of this week, which I'm so excited about. If you guys know anything about me, is that I love Shakespeare. I am obsessed with Shakespeare. I always have been. And you know that question that people sometimes ask, if you had a time machine or you could meet someone in history, where would you go? Who would you meet? My answer is always the same. 1603, London. And I would definitely meet Shakespeare. I would kill to be able to be in London in those times and act with the King's Men and in the Globe. Just what amazing time for acting, right? And for history. But of course, there are two main problems with that. The first one being that I'm a woman, so even if I was able to go back then, I would not be able to act with them. And second, chances of me finding a time machine are close to zero. So instead of that, I decided to just make all the research and find out what it would be like to actually be in those times. I feel like we have so many misconceptions of what acting in Shakespeare times could have been. I don't know about you guys, but for me, I always thought, probably acting back then was very exaggerated, or people who were actors would just go on stage. Maybe they probably had other jobs and they did acting as a part-time thing, and many other things that I've heard all over, right? Well, lo and behold, that's not the case. Doing my research, I found so many amazing things that I really wanted to share with you guys. But before we start, I wanted to share with you how I did my research, because of course, where would you go if you want to find out about something that happened hundreds of years ago and something that we really don't have that many sources? Yes, we have historical facts, but we don't have that much about acting in itself in the purest form. So I was surprised to find several books that are written by specialists about acting in Shakespeare times. And I wanted to share with you 3 of the most important ones, just in case you wanted to read them. I truly recommend them, really interesting stuff. The first one is Actors and Acting in Shakespeare's Time, The Art of Stage Playing by John Astington. Another one is Theatrical Training During the Age of Shakespeare by David Edgecombe. And the last one, The Best Actors in the World, Shakespeare and His Acting Company by David Grote. Another amazing source for acting in Shakespeare times are documents and writings and critiques, because there were also theater and acting critiques back then. One of the most famous ones is John Webster. And then the most important source, and one of the main sources that we have, and experts claim that it's the best one, is characters in plays, characters themselves. We have characters in Shakespeare plays like Hamlet and The Tempest and Henry VI and Midsummer Night's Dream, and they all talk about acting in one way or another. We'll talk about this later, but Hamlet has a speech that he's talking to the actors when they're about to act in his castle, and we can get a lot of clues of what acting or actors were expected to be in those times. Also, just to put this note in here, in those times it wasn't called acting or actors, it was called playing or players, but nowadays we call it acting and actors, so that's what I'm going to call it through the podcast. But first of all, to understand what acting was back then, we need to understand the importance of theater in that society. And the truth is that theater became a center of entertainment for that society that was mostly living to survive. The quality of life back then wasn't that amazing, and people didn't have TV or internet, and most people didn't know how to read either. So the only kind of escape from that mundane life they had was theater. It was a time where they could go with their friends and their family and experience something together. They could laugh, they could get distracted. It was a lot of fun, like it is now for us watching a movie, right? And for that reason, actors were really important, and they were a big part of that society. People actually admired them and loved them, but at the same time, it's very interesting to see that in the society rank, they were seen next to thieves and whores. And it's very funny to see that people loved what they did, but still, no, actors, that they're not that great in society standards. Which we actually kind of see nowadays too. I mean, people love watching movies and everything. People are like, yes, actors, we love asking for their autographs, right? But wait, if you tell your family that you want to be an actor, or when someone asks you, what do you do for a living? And you tell them acting, and they almost always make that face, and you know what they're thinking. So maybe it's not the same as back then, but there's still some kind of stigma around acting and doing acting for a living, right? So then it was the moment that actors were starting to be recognized in some kind of way, and that acting started to be a full-time thing. It started in the beginning of the 17th century, where we have recollection that in London there were from 150 to 200 professional actors, and that's crazy for those times. 100 years ago, that would be unthinkable. And the fact that in that time there were almost 200 people who were just solely dedicated to the art of acting tells you a lot about how theater and the performing arts evolved during that century and during what is the Elizabethan era and Shakespeare times. And it all started with acting itinerant troupes. Those were the ones who actually started what we would call nowadays acting techniques. And the reason for that is because they were traveling and they didn't have really fancy sets and they couldn't afford the best costumes. So basically all they had was themselves. So they were the ones who started thinking, okay, how can we make this better? How can this be exciting for the audiences? How can it be compelling? And then they started creating what we would say the acting technique. And the evolution of that would be what we start seeing later on in London, which is famous actors, people who are professionals, who are dedicated to the acting and are actually studying technique. And that would be like Richard Burbage or Edward Allen, among others. These actors were really concerned about their training, very invested in the arts and in theater, and their whole lives revolved around that. They would actually train on a daily basis, and that was their main goal in life. And we will get in another episode about what Shakespeare and actors were expected to do in those times and more the historical part of it. Today we're only talking about the training, but it's amazing. And if you learn what it represented to be able to be on that stage, you will understand what we're talking about today, which is all the preparation and extensive training they had to have. One of the main things actors needed back then is a big understanding of voice and breath control. The reason for that was that Shakespeare was actually the first one who broke away from the regular line scan and the heavy drops, so his blank verse was really different from what we had seen in writing years ago. His blank verse required really good breath support. His lines were longer, and in Shakespeare, punctuation didn't always mean breath or pause. So actors were required to be able to deliver that verse, that rhyme, in the way that Shakespeare would have wanted. Another very important thing for actors to know in those times was dancing. And that's such an important thing for that period because most plays, especially comedies, we can see that, for example, in Midsummer Night's Dream, include dances. And when I'm talking about dancing, it's usually something very specific to those times. They had these dances called Galliard and Capriole, and they had really intricate dancing techniques for that the actors had to train for daily too. And talking about movement, they also trained daily in fencing. And I loved seeing that because I think there is this misconception that, for example, in the movie Shakespeare in Love, we see that actors only knew how to fence, but for the stage, like kind of how we do nowadays, stage combat. But that's not necessarily true. It might have been true in some cases, but there's actually record of some actors, like, for example, Richard Tarleton, that were named big ranks in the fencing world. Richard Tarleton was Master of Fence by the English Fencing School, which was the highest rank in those times for fencing and fighting. So we can see that movement was also very important to them. And there's this really fascinating part of Elizabethan acting that I had never heard about before, and I don't think it's talked about that much, which is the importance of gestures on stage. Let me explain. They had a set of gestures that were used on stage in different situations, for different actions, for different emotions. And it's actually really funny to see there's graphics of it, like drawings that are written. I will post it on Instagram so you guys can see it. And what they did is change the gesture with the voice, and it was pretty much indicative. You can see in Hamlet's speech that I was talking about, he says, suit the action to the word and the word to the action. I mean, there are theories that believe that prepositions in Shakespeare or Elizabethan texts were indicators or markers of stage movement. And they just took gestures from real life, like it could be kissing someone's hand or blowing a kiss or throwing a fist in the air to indicate rage. That was a very common one, apparently. But they also created actions that were specific to the stage. And these were all very well-known actions that just were applied by all the productions. So actions and physicality were really important to them. But actors weren't just trained physically, they were also trained intellectually. And this part is also very fascinating, that all actors studied rhetoric. They were really focused on clear pronunciation and the melody and the voice and the rhythm. And they studied Roman text on oratory. And they actually believed that the only difference there should be between an actor and an orator is that the actor spoke the author's words through himself to express what the character felt, and the orator simply expressed his own words to express his own feelings. But other than that, the training was pretty similar. And in both cases, actors and orators thought that it was essential that the actor or the person speaking felt those emotions too, that the person was in connection with their own emotions, so those could be conveyed to the audience. So that is already explaining us how in those times acting started being something more than just entertainment, something more than just words or just words well delivered. Acting started being a tool of self-reflection too, especially for the actors, where it's already telling us that actors did a deep emotional connection with their characters and had to understand emotions really well to be able to do that. This was also a time where naturalism and realism on stage was starting to be introduced. Shakespeare was actually the one to introduce that natural speech. When I say natural, I think it's natural for those times. Of course, if we saw what they did back then nowadays, it probably would seem pretty exaggerated to us or not realistic at all. But for those times, they were starting to realize that there had to be a change, that our theater should be like real life. And they were working towards that. You know, we know that people didn't talk on real life like they did in Shakespeare plays. So the actors were expected to deliver the text in the most natural way, and that's the way Shakespeare intended those texts to sound. We have records of Richard Burbage, who I was talking about before, and he was actually one of the first actors of the Elizabethan era to openly support naturalism. He was a big advocate of characters not being stereotyped. He has been described as natural and unaffected. His characters were apparently all different, and he was playing many characters at the same time. I mean, Richard Burbage is the actor who originated all these leads in Shakespeare that we love so much today. And he really got into character and studied them and made sure that they were all different, that they were all what we call today three-dimensional, and that's such a revolutionary concept for those times. And then we can also see this naturalism that they are starting to get into in Hamlet's speech that I was talking about before too. He mentions words such as passion, smoothness, realism. I mean, he says exactly, hold the mirror up to nature, which in itself implies that in those times, they were already seeing theater as a place of self-judgment where life is explored in deeper ways. And these are also really revolutionary thoughts compared to those of older generations and what we had seen until then. So I found that really fascinating, of course, of those times. Another thing that really caught my attention and that I was wondering about was improvisation. Because nowadays we're pretty big in improvisation and we have stand-up comedy and we are even allowed to improvise in a lot of shows. But my intuition was telling me that that was not a thing in those times. I mean, for two main reasons. The first one being that all plays had to be approved by the Master of Revels, and I don't even want to think what would have happened if one of the actors would have said something that was considered illegal by the law. I mean, they were really analyzing every single word in those plays. And the second one is that the plays were written in verse, and I think that every single syllable and the rhythm and the rhyme was really important. So yes, in fact, I found that there was no place for improvisation. But I found that, of course, there were moments where actors would forget their lines, like it happens to the best of us. So that is the reason why we have different versions of the same play. The reason is because in the audience there would be people transcribing the play, and if an actor would change a word, that's how now we have several versions. And I thought that was a really interesting fact that I didn't know about. Another thing that I really liked learning about was rehearsals. Because in those times, they didn't have this thing we call rehearsals nowadays, which is pretty crazy to think of myself as an actor. Like, can you imagine putting Hamlet on stage or Richard III or one of these long and complicated and complex Shakespeare plays and not having rehearsals? What they did was study. They called it study. They would just, in their own houses, study their own roles on their own, and a couple days before the play, yes, they would get together and do it all together, and then off we go to show it to the audience. That is such a weird concept nowadays. But the truth is that rehearsals like we know them nowadays were considered a luxury until almost the 19th century. That's just amazing to think that they could do that. I mean, the leads of the plays sometimes would meet before the whole group met, but in their house, there was no director, there was nothing. So I think they should have learned a big deal of self-awareness and self-directing themselves, right? If they were able to do that. Which brings me to one of my last points and one of the most fascinating things of those times, which is apprentices. So apprentices were very common in all trades in those times. People had apprentices, and usually they were boys from 10 years old to 20, and they would be adopted by the family, and they would be taking care of the person who kind of owned them, their master. But in the case of theater, it was very different, of course, because theater is not the same as, Smith apprentice. So in the case of theater, these boys were the ones who were playing the female roles, and they were the ones who later on would become future members of the company. These boys who were 11 and 15 and 16 years old, teenagers, were originating these strong female characters that Shakespeare wrote about. And that is just so fascinating. It got me thinking to the level of training and the remarkable talent these boys had to have. I mean, famous actors like Richard Burbage, again, had many apprentices, and the relationship between the actor and their apprentice was really close. I mean, they, fed them, they lived with them, but I also found this really funny story about this apprentice that Richard Burbage used to have, and his name was Dickie Robinson. And when Burbage died, the apprentice married his wife. Now, I was shocked when I learned that, but apparently, as strange as it may seem, that was a pretty common practice. And that was the way that they could ensure that the husband's shares, Burbage shares, would stay in the company and in the family. Now, we know that Shakespeare didn't have any apprentice, or at least that's what we have in the records. If he did, we don't know about it. But Burbage had many of them. And I really liked the reason for that. And that is because that was the way he could ensure he would have good partners for his scenes. I mean, most scenes in Shakespeare plays are male and female. Female characters started to have a really big weight. So Burbage, being the lead on most of those plays, he got the boys and he trained them his way. And then he ensured that his scenes will always be amazing. Because remember, there was no rehearsal, so the director was the actor himself. So that was a really good, smart way for him to be in control of the situation. So these apprentices spent many hours and were a big part of the stages in those times. And even then, they were not paid, which I found very crazy. They were still the responsibility of the individual actor that was their master and owned them. But these actors were not paid. And they were doing this for many years, again, from they were probably 10 years old till 20, maybe when their voice changed and they couldn't play more female roles. But at the same time, I also think, if I was given the chance to be a child actor and learn and grow up acting with Richard Burbage and Shakespeare, wouldn't you do it? I guess you could say they got paid in the training they got, which was probably incredible. And in the end, they did end up being part of the company and then being paid once they were grown-up adults. So that's pretty much all I have on acting in those times. I found it really fascinating learning about all this and breaking some misconceptions that I had about Shakespeare times and what acting was then, and finding so fascinating that the acting we have now and the concept of acting we have now was starting to be developed in those times, and that those are the roots of the performing arts we have nowadays. And now, before we finish the episode for this week, I wanted to bring in the play of the week. This week, the play is Private Lives, an intimate play by Noël Coward. A lot of you might know this one. It's a classic. It's a comedy. It was written in 1930, and it was a big hit back then. It was actually on Broadway for a long time, and famous actors like Laurence Olivier and Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor were the leads of this play. Now, it's a little bit outdated in the comedy. It's, of course, written in the 30s, so there are some sexist connotations and some things that probably a play like this would not be written nowadays. But it's a really good piece of history for an actor to read. It has really good study scenes, because most of them are only two characters. So if you're looking for male-female scenes, there's also some male-male, female-female scenes. There are no monologues, but if you're looking to do something to get a little bit out of your comfort zone, do some old comedy, do a classic, this is a really good one. I actually had fun reading it. I actually laughed a couple of times. And it's really short. It has 55 pages. So it's a really quick read, and I think it's actually fun if you want to try to act it out, because it's gonna require a different kind of comedy than what we're used to nowadays. And even if it is written in the 30s and in some points a little bit outdated, it still has many relevant things that can be compared to nowadays. So I think you'll have a good time reading it. And this will be all for this week. If you enjoyed the episode, don't forget to subscribe on iTunes. And if you enjoyed The Actor's Vow, you can leave a review and rate 5 stars. That would be really helpful for the podcast. If you don't already, follow The Actor's Vow on social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Submit to Sunday Spotlight if you think you would be a good fit. And I will see you next Wednesday. Thank you.